Let me be honest and say I'd be glad not to speak tonight. I'd just be glad to hear Melinda talk more, particularly as the focus of this has been on children. And my primary concern and my primary involvement has not been as broad as that. I've focused on men. I focused on men because I am one. I focus on men because I have felt the heat in the kitchen in growing up in a sexualized environment. Relatively speaking, I grew up in a mildly sexualized environment. I've described to my wife, I think, perhaps the revelation that I had been significantly mentally adjusted by the Big M commercials of my generation, which are really mild. The girls running down the beach in bikinis with the boys running after them. That mindset had impacted me during the 60s in my university years. And because I didn't smoke margarine, I still remember the 1960s. The consequences of porn, in whatever form it comes, and that was a very mild form, is firstly that women are dehumanised. I guess it was my appreciation while speaking to a youth group over a weekend on sex that I had significantly been damaged by the mild forms of sexualisation that I had experienced, to the point where I had not fully appreciated that I was actually married to a person and not a face and a figure. And I was raised in a great home, a home where my father loved my mother and treated her with profound dignity and respect. In that environment, that had an impact on me. I think our marriage really started more effectively about 10 years in, when I recognised that that process had in many ways resulted in me dehumanising her. As I have grown, I've watched the impact of a rising level of sexualisation have its impact on men. This weekend, or this week, has been focusing particularly on how it has permeated down into the lives of children. I was flying somewhere, passing through Brisbane a few years ago, speaking on the Valiant Man issue, speaking to men, when in the Qantas lounge I came across a copy of the Brisbane Courier Mail, and on the front page, under the heading Unthinkable, was the story of local Brisbane primary schools where significant numbers of the girls had to be withdrawn from 3 different primary schools because of sexual assaults by boys of the age of 7 on girls at the age of 7 and 8. That for me, again, because I haven't had the privilege of hearing one of these presentations by Melinda until tonight, I thought I was fairly clued in. I've been speaking to teenagers and to older people on sexual issues ever since the 1970s. But to realise how this has now permeated down into the primary school and earlier ought to just simply disturb every one of us and make a decision that something has to be done. You aren't allowed to sell a can of apricots in this country if the label doesn't match what's on the inside, and if the contents could be damaging to somebody's health. And yet we are destroying an entire generation. What follows is and I watched this in the lives of men, the dissatisfaction with a real woman. As men get caught up in pornography, and we've been hearing how this has permeated down into the lives of children, but where I work interface with men. Watching people come into my office and tell me that they think they need to get divorced because they've fallen out of love. What do you mean? Well, we used to really love one another, but we don't love one another anymore. No, we've lost that loving feeling, woe, woe, woe. And when you get to the bottom of it, the reality is you have here a man who is enmeshed in pornography, who is more excited about playing with ink dots on a piece of paper or a flickering fluorescent screen than he is having an intimate relationship with a willing and loving wife. Dissatisfaction with a real woman. The fact is that men are highly vulnerable to pornography. And one of the attractions, one of the things that draws men in deeply is the degree of excitement they can get without investing an ounce of relational energy. It is the ultimate form of taking what you want and giving nothing in return. And out of that comes a dissatisfaction with a real woman. I've been married to Helen for 50 years. And I can say that it takes considerable work to have a good sexual relationship with a real woman. You have to resolve conflict. You have to address your unkind and unworthy behaviour. You need to deal with the things about yourself that cause another person not to want to be intimate. You have to deal with bad breath and 1,000 other things. It's an amazing thing how a DVD player requires nothing of you other than to press the button. And out of that grows a tragic dissatisfaction with real personal relationships. The impact of junk sex is also profound. The tendency to be living in a highly sexualized environment and what that does to the declining desire for honey in your own home. If I might be bold enough to use a verse from the Bible says, a full soul loathes even a honeycomb. I will never forget with the pilot program of Valiant Man, 120 men worked with me for 10 weeks. About the 7th week, as they began to detoxify, deliberately withdrawing as frequently as possible from the influence of visual sexualized material, they began to say to one another in the groups, I've fallen in love with my wife all over again. Well, what had happened to that woman to make her so much remarkably more attractive? And the answer is absolutely nothing. They were detoxifying. They were beginning to discover that their relentless consumption of sexualized material through advertising, and as Melinda pointed out, just walk through a shopping centre. Often women don't see it, but men are tuned to every square inch of an available woman's body and will turn towards it until they make very deliberate choices. I refuse to defile myself and carry that distortion into my relationships 1 hour longer. And out of that came a return of a normal appetite. It's a miracle. The fact that a healthy sexuality can be recovered, but it cannot be recovered in a defiling environment. One has to make decisions about what you will allow yourself to see. The impact of junk sex. The decreasing desire for a stable, committed relationship. One thing we know about porn is the more that one views it, the less men have an appetite to do the work required to build a healthy marriage, to care for children, to raise a home, to do all of the things that are required to have a stable and healthy community life. Porn tears the foundation out of a man's desire to work towards a stable and committed relationship. Sexual fantasies become forceful and violent, and if a woman doesn't want sex, there must be something wrong with her. I have this photograph sitting on my desk at home. It's a picture of the girl I married. 51 years ago, a 19-year-old girl stood beside me, and I said to her, forsaking all others and cleaving only unto you, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us do part. And that precious little girl pinned her future to my character. This is a picture of that little girl when she got to the age of 8. Her mother died in this year of her life from cancer. Her father became a functioning alcoholic. Her sister was removed from the family for 6 years because her father couldn't manage the 3 children, only 2 of them. And every time I look at this picture, I am reminded that that little girl has experienced a lifetime of suffering and does not need 1 more ounce from me. I have a passion to help plant a new vision for manhood in the hearts of young men and older men. A vision for a man to function in a household like an ox. I watched my father live like an ox. He was a servant in our household. My dad had a job as a school teacher and then a primary school principal. He faithfully did his job. He was outstanding at it. He never shirked his duties. He never once complained at the thought that all of his income went on providing for a wife and 5 children, some of whom needed some significant mental correction, myself being the chief of those. I watched my father live like an ox, and I lived. The Bible says, there's a lot of mess when there's an ox in the stable. I remind my wife that's in the Bible. But there's a lot of profit in having a good ox, a man who is willing to live for his community, his wife, his children. What a blessing. I had a father like that. My father was a lion. You would never want to say one thing to my mum and have him hear it. He had a belt that slipped quite easily from the trousers. My dad was an eagle. My dad had values. My dad had a faith. And it wasn't a plastic faith. He lived it in front of us as a family. And my father was a valiant man. He was courageous under pressure. And in that environment I grew up. I am the recipient of a privileged background. I wonder how in an environment like the one that Melinda has exposed to us today, do you raise young men capable of making a promise to a woman that he would guard, love, protect, and serve her all the days of his life and fulfill that promise while his character has been white-anted from the inside and has been savagely unformed because of the environment we have permitted to develop in our country. I have a passion. These are 7 of my 12 grandchildren. There's 4 little girls in that picture. I have 3 more to add to that. Every time I look at that picture, I think, where will these little girls find a young man they could trust for the rest of their life? I normally love to say, though, you'll find it in any community where people will raise good, healthy, and clean young men. What we need to recognize is we're going to have to fight like hell to have that happen for the next generation. We have a lot of work to do. It's a real privilege to know that there are people like Melinda and the others that have created this event this week who are labouring for the safety of the future of our nation. And it's a privilege to play a small part. I focus on a section of the community. I focus on seeking to realign men in the way they view themselves, their lifestyle, and their responsibilities. And porn goes to the core of that struggle. may we see the city without porn. God bless.